welcome everyone to what is actually the second of our Let's Talk webinars on the topic of generative artificial intelligence in higher education. The first we had in March, 4 months ago, which feels actually like an age ago in the world of AI. We had an incredible response, and I can see you all still joining now. We had 1,000 of you registering to join today's conversation, and that's actually as many as we could register, and at least 200 more of you are catching up via the recording, and so of course I should confirm that we are recording this session. I'm Gail Capper. I'm Research and Insight Manager at Pearson within our International Higher Education Division, and I have the absolute pleasure of guiding us all through our topic today and attempting to keep us on track so we can cover all the pre-submitted questions that we possibly can. And as we were saying, reading through your pre-submitted questions, there is a lot to talk about. If we don't get to the end, I suspect there'll be another session. Right, so a reminder of how this usually works before I introduce you to the wonderful panel that you can see. These sessions are an opportunity to talk, as the title says, about hot topics or interesting topics that is in a relatively informal setting. So as you know, that today that's going to be around practical implications and impacts of AI on our everyday lives as people who work in and around higher education. I would say please do get involved on the chat as we talk. Send us your thoughts, your questions, things that just occur to you at the moment. We'd love to hear them. And my colleague Karen Rowe is going to be curating those. And time allowing, I really hope that we'll be able to direct as many of them as possible towards our panel, towards the end of the discussion. And so to our panel. Right, I'm delighted to introduce you to Paula Shaw first. Anyone who's been on this session before will know Paula. She's Associate Professor of Online Teaching and Learning at the University of Derby. We also have Dean Fido joining us today, who's an Associate Professor of Forensic Psychology at the University of Derby. We have Kasper Wojciechowski, who's our Vice President of AI Capabilities here at Pearson, as well actually as being an academic and teacher in his own right. And I'm hoping that I can introduce you to Hashim when he joins. We're trying to let him in at the moment, but when he does join, he's a student at Queen Mary. We are trying to let him in right now so we can hear what he has to say about the topic of AI. Right, so let's get on with this. There's a lot to talk about. As I said, last time we talked was 4 months ago, and the conversation then it pretty much focused on, was AI friend, was it foe, were we pro, were we against, how did we feel about it, what was it? There was a lot of that kind of conversation. But since then, it feels like we've totally moved on, and most people are saying, well, you know, AI is here, so we need to really get to grips with the challenges that it presents, like impacting on, you know, academic integrity or assessment, as well as the potential that it has to change things in teaching and learning, or to innovate in teaching and learning, you know, freeing up time, which wouldn't that be wonderful for academics to add the value they want to in their teaching. You'll all have seen the poll, which I think is still live. We'll come back to that later, I think, to see how many of you are actually using AI. Oh, Hashim, it's so nice to see you. I'm so glad we could bring you in. And I forgot to say that you're now at the end of your first year course, aren't you, at Queen Mary? Okay, congratulations on getting to the end of your first year. Right, so if it's okay with everyone, let's go. Right, first I want to start with a bit of a definition, because we all sort of think we know what AI is. A lot of chat GPT conversation, you know, it's the one that most people talk about. Fastest growing application in human history, 100 million users in 2 months. But of course, generative AI isn't just chat GPT. Kasper, can I come to you first and maybe just put the question to you first about how do we actually define AI, and how does generative AI feel like it's changing things?
Sure, I think that would be helpful context for folks to get a shared understanding of what we're discussing today. AI is not a new field, and in fact, in education, AI has been used since the 1970s, really. But back in the day, those AI systems were created manually. You know, an AI system is essentially a computer program, and the early stage AI systems would require human subject matter experts to manually encode rules so that the computer knows what to do. So you would have, for example, systems that would try to diagnose patient illnesses based on a set of rules. So if the blood test shows this, then there's a chance that this is the bacterial infection. And then in the 2000s, we moved into the era of machine learning, where the paradigm switched. So we moved away from subject matter experts creating rules for AI systems towards collecting and curating data sets and allowing the systems to learn from those data sets on their own. So the system no longer relies on human created rules. It relies on the rules it creates on its own. They are not always transparent, but for the most part, they work. And this is what many people now associate with the sort of current state of machine learning systems, such as the ones that power speech recognition on our phones, or predictive text when you type in a message. And then generative AI, you can kind of think of it as an extension of that wave of machine learning, where these are still systems that rely on data to create rules. But specifically, when we talk about the most obvious example of those systems, which is ChatGPT, this is what we call a language model. So it's a system whose foundational goal is to understand how we can model human language, how to essentially output a sentence word by word so that it sounds like a plausible sentence in English. And the interesting thing that happened while AI researchers were creating those systems around 2018 and 2020 was that we learned that those systems actually, if you feed a system like that with enough data that is varied, pretty much you take a lot of internet text data and you feed it into a system like that, then it will not only learn how to generate plausible language, but it will actually learn how to carry out human tasks, the tasks that humans carry out in language, such as document summarization, question answering, translation. And that is different from this previous era of systems where you would have only one system that specializes in translation. We have one system that specializes in question answering. Whereas those systems that we have observed over the past couple of months, especially since the democratization of access to those tools via ChatGPT, this is essentially a one general purpose system which not only understands language, but also is able to generate language. So that would say is the difference between the more traditional AI systems and generative AI systems.
Thank you for that. Paula or Dean, do you want to add anything to that in your kind of context?
I think just to put it very simply, that there are tools that AI helps us either to save time, or there are social elements, and those are kind of the two main camps in education that we really like to concentrate on. How can we save time? And we've really not started on that yet. I'm sure academics would love to save lots and lots of time, but let's have a think about how that might happen. And students as well. Students want to save time. We're all time poor people. But then there's the social aspect of it. How can we learn to be more social with it? How can we embrace it and build it into what we're doing?
Yeah, thank you. Dean, did you want to add anything there?
No, I think Paula summed it up beautifully. There's also an added element, as Paula was saying, in terms of trying to. The next step for me is going to be helping students to learn how to construct a very specific and precise prompt. There was actually some data very, very quickly. Some data came out a couple of days ago, which tried to suggest that ChatGPT is actually getting worse in terms of its feedback. It's going to be a very critical paper. However, we know that these language models are becoming more and more person-based in terms of how they are putting prompts into the machine to get that output. And so if students and academics alike aren't constructing prompts which are going to be conducive of getting that output, then that's where we're going to be seeing quite a lot of shortfall, I believe.
Okay, thank you. I think we should get straight into some of the questions. There were so many pre-submitted questions. It was fabulous. And Paula actually did do the activity of feeding them into GPT, didn't you, to see what it sent out? And it was actually quite helpful, putting them into order for us. But we're kind of, the way we want to do it today is to look at at the now, and then towards the end we'll look more towards the future of AI. So I think maybe let's get straight into that world of AI and practical ways that people are engaging, interacting with it, and maybe how students are using it right now. Hashim, to come to you later. Thinking about teaching, anything from preparing, facilitating, as you said, Paula, there are common challenges across people, roles, departments, institutions, increasing class sizes, workloads, student expectations definitely have already increased and will continue to, I expect. So the first question is a big one, I suppose, but how do you think generative AI can be used to address some of those challenges that we've already sort of highlighted in what you said, Paula? As I said, anywhere from planning, preparing, facilitating, right through to supporting. Paula, yeah, you go first.
So I mean, if we're talking about here and now, look at where we are in the academic year. We're getting ready to start preparing for the next academic year. So how could AI, generative AI, be useful to us right here and now? Well, if we're thinking about lesson planning, you know, and we've only got so much brain power, we can only be so creative. Let's think about how it can maybe help us to do the first steps of, say, a lesson plan. And then we can always tweak that. We can decide whether it works for us. And then we can ask it to generate maybe some quizzes or some formative assessment, which we can then build into those lesson plans. So those are some quick steps that we can actually do right here and now. And it'll take us beyond our current thinking. You know, if you haven't used generative AI yet and you ask it to do something like that, create a lesson plan, you'll be surprised at where it then takes your thinking, and then you've then got more time to build in that criticality. You know, we often talk about generative AI being biased. So how do we make sure then that the lesson plan isn't biased and we can spend more time on doing things like that? But I think at the other end of the scale, like you say, we have to prepare students for work-ready graduates. So then we need to be thinking about how do we understand how employers are using AI? How do we build that into our courses so that we're preparing students for the future? So I think those are the two ends of the scale for me.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And just to take what Paul is saying further, one thing that you can do, and I tried this the other day, was to take a job specification, feed that into something like ChatGPT, and say, based on this job specification, what future employers are looking for. I'm an academic. I'm teaching this particular course in this particular area of the world. What sort of activities can I get my students to do in either as individuals or in groups, which can help build skills for this job? And you get 3 or 4 beautifully laid out activities, which you can then tweak and modify depending on the resources you have, which can ultimately push and challenge our students, which I don't think any academic is doing at the minute.
Okay. Casper, have you got any thoughts on that?
Paula, you raised a very good comment towards the end, saying that, you know, the AI is becoming a 21st century digital literacy skill. So I would say, if there's only one message, at least from me here today, is that, you know, we need to embrace AI, if only to help our students get ready for the workforce, because you can see AI being now embedded in operating systems such as Windows, in productivity suites such as Office, across more specialized tools such as programming environments. So certain types of jobs, this is now becoming a fundamental skill, and it's not like, you know, AI is going to replace people, at least not right away, but it's certainly going to replace people who don't use AI. So at least, you know, if we can help our students become more acquainted with those types of tools, the better. And then Dean, you raised an excellent point. You know, those tools have a tremendous sort of general purpose capability to assist across a wide range of tasks, and it's usually only our creativity that establishes what's possible. And maybe we can touch upon, you know, later on today on some of the strategies as to what teachers and assessors and staff can do, as well as learners, in terms of how to operate these tools and how to get the most of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about skills we definitely are going to do that moving on, and thinking about the future of work as well, actually. But for now, to bring us back to that teaching context that you talked about, Casper, I'm keen to understand what you think AI can bring to what you already deliver. So what's already a high quality, learning or teaching experience. Are there ways that you think you could bring in AI, or you've seen other people bringing in AI to enhance what it is you already do? And that can be to anyone.
And I guess there are two ways, two lenses through which I always look at it. One is what I do as an academic teacher, so what I can do individually, and the other thing is what companies such as Pearson or other institutions really are doing today. So how systems like that are getting now integrated into your typical learning management system or your typical educational product. I think I'll focus for this audience more on what the individual teacher can do, and Paula indeed raised some of those points already. I think there was the two main ways of looking at what the individual teacher can do. One is the creation, this of automation of content, curriculum or content creation. So how to automate the process of creating traditional activities. So, if you want to generate more essay prompts or generate more multiple choice activity, that's a good way of doing that. Or lesson outlines, which are customized to your class. And then the other way is creating those. Let me take a step back. What we can do with generative AI these days, what the general audience can do is essentially using prompts. And I saw someone mention that already in the chat. We can program those AI systems to behave the way we want. We can use natural language without any need for computer language use, and we can give the system the context, the instructions into how it should behave. And there's this sort of entire nascent field of how to write a big prompt, which you can then hand over to the learners and have them sort of start going into this interaction feedback loop. It won't replace a teacher, but it's the best we can do. At least, if the learner wants to have some after hours practice or interaction with within the remits of what the teachers have set, and that's the next big thing. So it's not only generating content for the class, like traditional maybe print content, but also sort of creating those micro learning experiences that you can hand over to the learner.
You know what? I'd like to understand from Hasim. How do you feel about having a teacher supported by AI to create your materials? What do you think about that?
I feel, it can be quite positive so long as it is just the support. I don't believe it should be the entirety of the teaching. But what I've found is if a lecturer has a really good lesson plan that's very comprehensive in a content or something, AI can definitely further my understanding personally. If I'm struggling to grasp a concept and the lecturer can't quite get through to me on a certain thing, I will quite often go to ChatGPT. And although I don't take it as gospel, like it's completely correct, it can still definitely further develop your understanding for something. So it's kind of like extra layers of information and detail that you can have. But I can also see how it can be misused as well. But I think it's the same as anything. Even if it's a good thing, if it's not used appropriately or if it's used in excess, it will become a problem. So I think if you use ChatGPT and don't let it use you, it won't be a problem.
That's a great saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I really like that, and what Hashim said there about being able to re-look at things that lecturers might have said that might not have clicked with you is something that we picked up in our paper with Louise Wallace at the start of this year, and that was a key outcome, and especially we see that with perhaps students who might sit in the back of the classroom proverbially, not want to put their hand up or don't feel they can put their hand up and question a lecturer. There might also be some cultural boundaries there which we need to be appreciative of, and so they can actually try to better access that lecture and that workshop material by using ChatGPT. I think it can be really positive if we do see it in that light. So yeah, Hashim, very much thank you for that.
Oh, one more thing to add is that I think it could be subject specific as well. So I'm personally a medical genetics student, so I'm only got experience within science, but I feel like for subjects that are less conceptually demanding, such as business or history, where it's more just volume and content, I don't think ChatGPT has the same utilization that it has in a science or a maths or an engineering, where they're quite often, for all students, there's always going to be one or two topics that you don't quite fully grasp. And I think ChatGPT can just kind of dissolve that barrier.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. In fact, I was reading just that comment in an article the other day that the use in kind of arts and humanities is far lower than it is in STEM subjects. And I saw a comment about neurodivergence as well, which I think is another power for good. I don't know if anyone has particularly explored that who's on the panel today. You know, if a student is dyslexic, for example, the power of AI is actually very, very high and very valuable for those people. I've been reading. Have you got any experience, anyone, of that kind of issue?
Not been exploring it as such, but generally, as we know, working online, you can set your preferences and you can change things to help you to the online environment is much more adaptable to setting the preferences to the way that you want it, rather than a classroom where a teacher is trying to set an expectation for the whole group. So it wouldn't surprise me that more research will come out on that in the way that people use artificial intelligence. I mean, let's face it, we've been using Grammarly for years. You know, I don't think there's many academics that don't know about Grammarly. Now, if you're a student with dyslexia, you know, just reconstructing that sentence and spellings and things like that can be absolutely valuable from that point of view.
And I also noticed someone in chat very early on mentioned about how we use calculators. We use it as a tool. And it might be time for us to start shifting how we think conceptually about AI. We think about it as a tool to help us, and then it becomes a lot more palatable for both staff and students.
Yeah, thank you for all of those thoughts. Talking of specific subjects, I don't know if there was a very specific one in the pre-submitted questions, and it was about strategic management particularly. Is there a particular strength of AI in those kinds of areas? I don't know, Dean, I know we talked about it previously, and I can't remember what we were talking about. Was that about prompts as well, or authoring? Yeah,
so I think about kind of trying to make sure that our students have that kind of capability, and also the staff, if we are to use it, have that capability to understand what makes a good prompt, understand the nuances, and also the iterations by which we can build upon those prompts. We can have chatbots take a particular perspective, which can also help to challenge and increase critical thinking. And I think when we were talking about that, we were talking about a paper which Paula, myself, and our colleague Gary Fisher are working on at the minute, where we actually competed against one another, human-generated teaching and learning content versus AI-generated learning content based on that human-generated material. And we shared it with 500 students, and actually the students had both qualitative feelings about and also quantitative perceptions for the ChatGPT generated content over and above the human generated, and that shows a level of acceptance and also appreciation for perhaps how AI generated content might be more consolidated, more precise in the wording. And so that's definitely not to say we don't need human generated content, because we very much do, but it might change the perspective on a managerial level as to how academics are working, how they're constructing their material, and ultimately, fingers crossed, speed up that element, which can take a long time.
Mm-hmm. And that brings us back to the time element then. So what do we then get the academics to do if you like, the framework is formed by content which is created by something like ChatGPT? Well, as we've talked about, you know, Dean's a fantastic associate professor in criminal psychology. Yeah, do you know, that's the expertise that we absolutely want in there. So he could focus then on the case studies and the activities that we want students to do. we're not bothered whether he can fit 11 words in a sentence and add a full stop at the end of it. You know, let ChatGPT deal with that aspect of it. Let's use Dean's expertise, his years of knowledge, to really enhance that content.
Yeah, it might be a good time actually to come to one of Hashim's points. I think it links into that actually, which is about creating this idea of a healthy use of AI within students, and how we can support students, given the the huge benefits that AI can bring. How do we support students to develop that really critical eye over AI generated content versus human generated content, and how do we go about doing that? I don't know who wants to take that first.
It's something that I've been working with quite closely with my master's students. I started the year by saying, this is a thing, I need you to be conscious and wary of this, because what we could do as academics is bury our heads in the sand and pretend it's not happening when it actually is. And what happens with that, and I think that's what lots of the fear around academia at the minute is that students will then start using it. We've had a couple of cases, like I'm expecting lots of universities to have, where students have tried to generate entire essays using ChatGPT. And without that level of critical thinking, they won't be checking the citations, which we know are outdated and in some instances incorrect. They won't be rereading that material to see what's repetitive or not. So it's about saying to students, there are all of the shortfalls, and here's some concrete examples, but here's some really positive ways about how you can do it. And one thing that I gave a very clear example was with generating a couple myself of essay plans, feeding both into ChatGPT, and then getting ChatGPT to help me critically consolidate and compare those two essay plans, which said that one might be stronger in this aspect, whereas the other gives you that leeway to explore this sidearm. And I think if we can direct students towards the concrete benefits, that will help increase the critical thinking.
Asim, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I've just received a question from Farzana, which says, have you seen your lecturers use AI positively in lessons? I personally haven't. No lecturer has ever said don't use it, but they've never actually utilized it. But sometimes there'll be like a very black and white question that we'll get at the start of the lesson just to kind of warm our brains up. And a lot of the time you think you can spend however long looking through this textbook and that textbook and ensuring you've got the right edition and the information is correct, or you can just put it into ChatGPT. Now, this is like some people will have a different perspective on it, because they feel as if you spend that time researching in a textbook, you're going to probably have a more comprehensive understanding of the question that the lecturer is asking. Whereas if you search it on ChatGPT, you're going to get an answer that is probably correct, but there's going to be no understanding to support the information that it's giving you. So I think that it can be used within a lecturer's setting, but as you said, Dean, that there's no need to act like it doesn't exist, because that's going to make the problem worse. I think lecturers should instead clearly outline what could be productive about the use of ChatGPT and how it can easily become very unproductive, and then trust students' judgment after that point.
It's interesting how you've both talked about, well, I've got another colleague basically that's just starting to write a pedagogic paper about iterationism, and how this is developing as perhaps a new form of pedagogy going forward, a new theme, and thinking about starting with something that has been AI generated, bringing it to the class, having a discussion, taking it away, iterating, improving, adding to, extending, questioning, critiquing, etc., etc., etc. beyond that. And we're still then developing those higher level skills that we want students to have, and yet still embracing AI to some extent, during that process.
Let me just pick up on that real quick, because you always very good points, which I think, if we take a step back and look at where we are today, with education in general, and where we could be and what the future is of AI in education, it's an interesting question as to how to bridge this gap. Because even if we look at the first couple of months after the release of ChatGPT, The initial reaction was to ban it in many schools, and people cited, well, concerns about unethical behaviors, but also that it doesn't help build critical thinking skills. And then after a couple of months, when the risk was assessed, we saw this sort of gradual acceptance that this is here to stay. And especially in the UK, we saw a lot of good papers, for example, from the Joint Council for Qualifications, a nice brief for teachers and assessors, demystifying what generative AI is, helping people understand how to look for signs of unethical behavior. Well, first of all, how to establish guidelines for how AI can and probably shouldn't be used in the classroom for homework, and then how to help students understand that. Hashim used to raise a good point about where to use ChatGPT and where to not use it. Well, one cannot ChatGPT their way out of a job interview. That's for sure, right? So there's a limit as to how we can use it. And Paula, what you mentioned about how people are now starting to think about changing, even from the ground up, the sort of approach to education, such as from a one-off submission of a text towards, or pretty much iterating with the system, the AI system as an agent, because the AI system is just another agent, just like a teacher is, or just like another student is. It's just that this agent is available there for you 24/7. So that, I think, is a good, is a nice first step towards sort of changing the face of education as we know it.
Thank you. Hashim, actually, I want to come to you and ask you a question about, what you see around you. Do you see people using AI? Are people concerned about potentially whether they're misusing it or whether they're using it correctly? Whether, what's the feeling that you're getting from people around you?
I haven't seen, to be honest, many people use it how I deem it to be correct. I've seen a lot of people use it just to, they've missed the lecture and they need to quickly catch up, and they'll just put it all in ChatGPT and try and make notes of it. So I feel like that could be problematic. But again, I feel like that's not a fault of ChatGPT, but rather our use of it. And I've seen people also, if they do their lectures online, they'll use ChatGPT with it, which I personally think is quite a good idea, because as the lecturer is going through something, you can prompt yourself. And what I like about it is just giving you answers, but it's not entirely passive. You have to make sure you feed the correct information in. So you're still actively learning and you're still engaged. And I feel like personally for me, it helps me engage more. Sometimes if a lecturer is speaking for like 2 hours, it's natural that your attention span dwindles a bit, no matter how much you try to focus. And I feel like a prompt on ChatGPT can kind of just keep you alert and awake. Another thing, I think from the academic side, I think it's so disruptive to like the fundamentals of education that you sit there and you listen to a lecturer or a teacher and you don't do anything else. You don't use your phone, you don't do anything. I think that's why there's a lot of fear around it, that it's kind of shaking up everything from like the very fundamentals of teaching. From very early age, we're taught that you just put your phone away, you don't use the internet, like you just listen to your teacher. And I think maybe it is time for a bit of a change in that regard, because if we have all these resources and tools that can aid our learning, then I think it can only make us better. I think there just needs to be a little bit more attention as to how we actually do use it. But I definitely don't think it's a good idea to completely turn away from it and just deem it. I can see why traditional academic would completely shun it and just be like, we don't need this. But I feel like in today's age where everything's moving towards more efficiency, maybe we could have less contact hours, less teaching hours, and we can utilize AI a bit more. And I think it's only going to make us better if we use it correctly.
That's a great point you make there. I think a lot of students might disagree with you and think it's less value for money to reduce some of the teaching hours, but actually, how can we use the teaching hours better? I think that is absolutely crucial. That there's way too many long lectures still in higher education and not enough active learning. And the active learning is where, as you say, Hashim, you can move, you can do something, you can engage with others. And actually, it's that diversity that exists in the classroom that you want to draw on as well. Not just listen to somebody a sage on the stage, a sage on the stage spouting what they have in their knowledge bank, but it's actually how you understand that as a cohort of students that's most important.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And even though I would love to listen to myself talk for 3 hours, my students very much don't like that. And so going back to what kind of Paula was saying, and also Ashim, in terms of who understands what, oftentimes what I do in kind of my teaching now is triangulation of learning. So I might have a concept and I split my classroom into thirds. One third might be trying to understand that concept from a published paper. Another third might be trying to understand that concept from newspaper articles. And another third might be listening to a podcast and trying to digest that information. Then they bring that together and we have individual group discussions and also classroom discussions. And what that allows us to do is not only understand something from multiple perspectives, but also to add that critical challenge into saying, well, this is how newspapers report this. However, that's not always the case because this is how experts talk about it in podcasts. And I've got an excellent PhD student at the minute, Courtney Hammond, who's very much trying to explore how academics or subject experts might have to change themselves when they are talking in the public sphere on documentaries or podcasts. And so that also enables students, when they leave my classroom, to go to a job interview and say, I do understand this knowledge, and I don't just have to talk about it in this way to my colleagues, but I can talk about it in this way to the general public who might be buying your products, or I can talk about it in this way to advertisers who we might need to persuade to give us money that way. And so it can have a lot of application, especially if we then back end that onto an array of pieces of coursework which aren't just your generic essays. I think on my entire program, Masters in Forensic Psychology at Derby, we only have 2 essays now, and the rest are a mixture of podcasts, presentations, and portfolios, reflective diaries, things that you just can't use AI for in that way of cheating.
Yeah, that's really interesting because we haven't touched on assessment yet, and it's one of the main questions that came out. So I do want to touch on it briefly. Lots of discussion about it, but is there a way to really embrace AI in assessments? I'm interested to hear what you think from anyone.
I'll jump in. I mean, the more authentic you can make it, the better it is. However, we have to, I thought the idea that higher education students, full-time higher education students on campus are very much simulating something rather than being situated. The difference is with online students who are generally in the workplace, they've got more opportunities to simulate something, situate something, because they can see it happening in the real world. So when we talk about authentic assessment, there are layers. We can't offer authentic assessments to a first trimester, first year student necessarily, because they won't have the experience to kind of think about how that's necessarily applied. But yeah, building that authenticity through the journey, through higher education is absolutely key, really, with assessments. And the more authentic it is, the less the essays or ChatGPT can be writing the material for them.
I also think it can be used as a means of going back to that kind of cultural variation and making sure that everything we teach and everything we say is accessible to all, hopefully in an ideal world. Something that I've used before in my teaching material, which could be back-ended onto assessments, is I've given an example or tried to explain a particular subject in a way, and I've seen lots of blank faces, which is always scary for an academic because you're supposed to be able to present that information in a really clear way. So I took a recording of my lecture, I took the transcript of what I said exactly, fed it into ChatGPT, and asked whether there was a way that I could, present this information in a slightly clearer way, or whether there's any examples that could be really useful to bolster it that for a particular audience. And you can specify that audience. And that's something which has come in quite a couple of times for me. And I think it's really not only elevated the information that I've been given, but also allowed me to grow as an academic and have that wider awareness, which when you're on the spot is obviously difficult sometimes to include, but it's important.
if I could just pick up on Paula's point about authentic assessment, which I loved, it's interesting that we have had AI systems that enable authentic assessment in certain areas for many years now, and people kind of accepted that. At Pearson, for example, we've pretty much pioneered the use of automated assessment of speech and writing for high stakes summative assessments, especially for language learning, but also for formative writing assessment and feedback. And those systems were able to really understand natural language. So instead of, for example, asking someone to read a piece of text and then have them complete a multiple choice question, you would maybe read a piece of text or look at a graph and then describe it using your own words in speech or in writing. And it's only now that these systems can kind of talk back to you that people notice that there's this class of AI systems that can do this. They've existed for years. And so for sure, we're going to see a lot of commercial applications very soon that will, either for the institutions or for direct learners, we'll see, we already are seeing chatbots coming up here and there, built-in products. So it's going to be interesting to see how what we're doing in the classroom compares to what people can do with commercial products. And there are some ways that we can try and catch up as teachers and assessors. For example, you could, using any of the free large language models, such as ChatGPT, but there are so many of them now available freely. You could, for example, program a role play. Again, it's a matter of how you design a prompt and hand it over to the student, and then have the student role play at home or in the classroom, and then have a discussion as to what the experience was. There are certainly some ways we can try and sort of move towards authentic assessment and move away from sort of older conceptualizations of learning.
Fascinating. Hashim, I do want to bring you in as well, because you're having to complete assessments and assignments. And what do you think about how would you want to be assessed in the future on your knowledge?
I think so. For in-person assessments, obviously there's no use of any internet or anything, and I feel like that is sometimes required because there is certain, like for example, in my tissue biology module, we have a lot of histology in it, and I feel like if it wasn't in person, it would genuinely be too easy because you just need to find the histograms and then label them up. So you can use a textbook for that. You can input images into ChatGPT. It's too easy because it's just too much of a black and white subject. But I think for subjects like certain essays that are a bit more of a grey area and there's different perspectives and takes that students can take on them, ChatGPT can be useful. Because obviously there's different insights to different things, especially I think within science, because there's so many different ways that things are looked at. It's not just black and white the way, say, maths could be seen as. Science is more about developing and it's quite progressive. And I think technology such as ChatGPT can be useful for it because you can use, I'm trying to think of an example. So we did something on robotic arms, for example, and there's so many different perspectives you can take to a subject like that. It's not a very linear thing. And I think in cases like that, ChatGPT can be used because the student can put as much of ChatGPT as they want, but if they don't have their own perspective and knowledge on the subject, it will come across in an essay or a scientific report, for example. So I feel like that's very dependent upon what type of assessment it is. I personally like the split I've got, which is about 50-50, 50% online, 50% in person. For example, my lab assessments, there's literally nothing ChatGPT can do for you, or it can do very little because you're in a classroom for 3 hours, your phone is away, you're not allowed to speak to anybody. And I think that's also very important because you need to be practically competent at your subject as well as theoretically. So I feel like a use of the both is the best way forward rather than black and white, as in just saying one is good and one is bad.
Thank you. Casper, I don't know if you were about to come in at one point there. I saw you almost say something. If not, I can move on.
Total agreement.
Okay, good. There's two areas I'm toying up with. I'm looking at the time we've got left. One of them is about kind of skills, and one of them is about the future and work, and they're kind of related, really. There's a lot of talk about, well, are we actually, how are we going to encourage that critical skill, that thinking within students, that bit of maybe initial struggle of coming to terms with maybe all the information that's coming towards you? How can we, I suppose the question there is, how can we encourage the skills that we want to see in our students? And the second part of that is really actually, what skills will be needed in the future? You know, what will workplaces, employers be looking for in students? And I think they tie together as a kind of a skills and the future of work question. So any thoughts you've got on any of those areas would be very much appreciated.
I mean, it's going to differ vastly, isn't it, from sector to sector? I think I'm conscious there's lots of academics in the room. I always have this saying that, you know, academics have certain job roles that they have to attune to, and we can't not teach, we can't not do our admin. We don't want to avoid doing any pastoral care for the students, because that's vastly important in the modern world that we're in now. So when our workload does get high, what always drops from that is the research side of things. And so I think that being able to work effectively with AI is going to be very attractive to academic employers, because alongside student fees, research is a huge income generator. And I think that lots of academic institutions might be losing quite a lot of money from that, you know, lack of research output. And as Paula very kindly said about myself, it's a lot better use of my time and, at the end of the day, wages to be put into the research and fine-tuning things rather than writing and generating content. And I think that Hashim has talked very eloquently about the differences in terms of some of the harder sciences. And there's been quite a lot of comments in terms of the business world as well in the chat. Everyone's going to want different things, but what's at the core base of that need is the ability to generate really informative and impactful prompts, and also that element of the critical eye in terms of using AI. And I think that's going to be a foundation, and hopefully it's something that can be implemented across universities as a sidearm to all programs.
Thank you.
That's great points there. I think I probably want to add to that, you know, if we're looking at the end of the programme and creating these work-ready graduates, we really got to look at the beginning of the programme with curriculum design as well, and that needs a massive shake-up. I mean, we often design programmes for 3 years. Now, if I go back 3 years, in the last 3 years, we've had, 2 years of COVID and ChatGPT come in. You know, how could we have even imagined that all that was going to happen within a 3-year period? So when we're designing programs, we're thinking, oh, what's that graduate going to come out with at the end of 3 years? It's really difficult to imagine what the world is going to be like in 3 years' time if we couldn't imagine what the last 3 was going to happen. But it does mean that initial shake-up. I mean, starting right, whenever we're thinking about recreating any curriculum, we need to be really thinking about what are the skills that students really need to come out with at the end, and building that in right from the beginning and layering that up through the years so that they get more familiar and more confident with those skills. But absolutely, the fundamentals of higher education don't change. Critical thinking, and this is exactly what we're doing here. And Hasim's shared some fantastic examples of critical thinking already this morning, but we need to continue to develop that, because what we do need in the future is really good critical thinkers.
Let me just add to those points, because these were excellent points. You know, the benefit of those, you know, well, the immediate disadvantage that we all notice of generative AI tools is that, you know, they write essays. So that's okay. We can no longer give essays to students, but then the opportunity here is that we can work on those 21st century skills, such as critical thinking, such as collaboration, such as communication, those skills that are not going to be automated anytime soon via text-based large language models. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Like one, you know, just for the classroom, print out, and that kind of touches upon Dean's, I think, triangulation strategy, which I thought was excellent. You know, bring some materials to the class, hand them out, and then, you know, have students bring their own device, you know, read the documents, try and draft a compelling argument using large language models, and then try to present to each other, try to convince and negotiate. So it's, you know, there's no going away from first draft automation. That's happening already. So those kinds of systems are going to write emails for us, documents and all that. It's a question of how we then put the human touch onto these documents and how we then communicate that to other humans and how we negotiate, how we collaborate. Another example, which I suggested earlier, is craft a prompt, and I think we have some excellent suggestions in the chat as to how to author prompts. I sent out one paper that I can recommend, and I know Dean also published something on the web, which he probably already put in the chat as well. If you can write a prompt along the lines of you are an angry customer, and and then have a role play discussion. That actually works pretty well. So you can have students practice just the real world challenges, try and convince a grant panel which doesn't agree with you on some sort of things. You can come up with numerous scenarios for those role plays, and that's an easy fix to move away from traditional activities towards the authentic assessment that Paula mentioned, but also skills that are going to be needed regardless of whether we continue to write documents manually or whether AI does it for us.
Just and without meaning to take the chair away from Gail, one of the key things that I think might underpin a lot of what we're talking about today, and also I'm seeing lots of kind of AI related plugins being mentioned in the chat as well. If we are moving to this world, we do need to look at the disparity that it might and the equality across students and academics. We've all been short of money recently, right? And we all know that our students don't have all the money in the world. Lots of these plugins, lots of these AI techniques are free. Others are vastly enhanced with a subscription cost. You can use ChatGPT at baseline and it'll go back to 2021, but lots of the new plugins, if you want to use video, if you want to use AI generated audio, it all requires subscriptions and fees. And so with so much inequality that we identified through COVID, actually, in terms of lots of students not having access to good quality internet or even laptops to use the good quality internet, are we then expecting students to be better or worse off depending on whether they can afford to use AI? And I think that's something that we all very much need to be mindful of moving forward.
Thank you, Dean. Yeah, I'm mindful that actually we haven't got very long left, and still I've got so many questions that I could ask to you all, but I'm sure that we'll get back together to ask them. I mean, staying up to date with what's happening, best practices, I imagine that that's a huge challenge in itself. How do we actually, where do we go to find out where best practices are? Is there anywhere we can all go? Have you got any suggestions?
I think the chat has answered itself really, and we've answered ourselves. If there's one thing you have to take away from this webinar, is learn how to prompt. Whether you want to embrace it, whether you want to stick your head in the sand, the one skill that you're going to need is to learn how to prompt. And there's quite a few websites around and spaces, and even academic papers are now reporting on good ways of prompting for education skills.
Thanks, Paula. I don't know if anyone else has any suggestions, but as you say, the chat has been alive. I can see things pinging up in front of me as we've been talking. With a few minutes, this is quite a big question to ask. A few minutes, should I go for it? Yeah, why not? One of the final questions was more about the more distant future, but let's try it. What do you think? I mean, maybe go to Dean as a psychologist. Will there be a point in the future where our kind of emotional intelligence, our EQ, is passed on to this kind of AI technology in a way that they're more able to be empathetic? In that scenario, how do we avoid being controlled more by the AI? Can we work in synergy? What does that future look like?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think that might boil down to one thing that we are combating quite heavily in academia at the minute is loneliness in students, companionship, generating a community. I'm doing a little bit of work with Dr. Robin Mooney, University of Derby at the minute on an AI app called Replica. And in Replica, you can have a personal relationship with an AI-generated avatar. You could also have a romantic and sexual relationship with that avatar as well. It's got functionality for that. And we're looking to see how those psychological aspects of loneliness, anxiety, depression within these individuals is mapping on. And I think that for students, it could be a very vital companionship tool. And I think for everyone in the general population, being able to use it to perhaps develop emotional resilience, develop social skills. We know that lots of people are isolated, and again, that we had a spotlight on that during COVID, especially in terms of access to health, access to communities. Public health is a huge global concern internationally, and so I very much think it does have a lot of applications and opportunities, and I'm very, very excited to see how we can develop that over the forthcoming years.
Wow.
There is a dystopian view, of course, as well, where people think it's going to it's an existential threat to humanity and how we behave as humans. I think ultimately we need to understand what humanity is and be more human. And if we have to focus jobs around what it is to be human, then perhaps that's where the future goes.
Thank you. I'll just come to you, Casper and Hashim, to see if you've got any final thoughts.
I think there's already a lot of interesting work that's trying to bridge the gap between where we are today and where we could go, and how AI could sort of become a larger part of our lives. There's an interesting project done by the US-based National AI Institute for Student AI Teaming, where my friend and colleague Peter Foltz does a lot of work on how to embed AI systems in the classroom for K-12 to help them, essentially extend the role of the teacher, who cannot always supervise a large group when it comes to measuring whether students stay on topic when they work as a team, whether they actually show evidence of developing skills that are needed to work as a team, such as interpersonal understanding, proactivity, decision making as a group. So I think there's, before we even go to AI systems that can not only understand text but perceive images and sounds and talk back. There are these things we can start doing and that we are doing in terms of at least making them more helpful and safe in education.
Thank you. We've only got a minute to go, Hashim. Have you got any last final thoughts for us?
Yeah, I'd say for me, it's for interpersonal and intrapersonal skills, I believe that shouldn't really have AI or virtual reality interference. Although I do feel as if it could have some utilization within learning disabilities. I personally worked in a daycare where we used VR to shadow certain tasks such as cooking a meal or making a coffee. And I think it can be very, very useful for people who aren't quite able to do these things in real life yet. And it's in a very safe, controlled environment. But I feel like when we start replacing romantic and social relationships, which is quite a pivotal part of human existence, I think that, in my opinion, it's just a bit too far. I don't think it's necessary. I think it should be used for worldly stuff rather than emotional stuff.
Thank you, and for keeping to time. I want to thank everyone here for joining today, and Karen, thank you for manning the chat. I'm sorry we didn't have time to come to it actually. I couldn't keep up with the chat either, but thank you all for coming. Thank you, panelists, for your insightful comments. Thank you everyone on the chat for joining in. There will be a feedback form, so if you want to give us any more topics that we can talk about or highlight anything you want to spend more time on, please fill in the feedback form, and we all can't wait to see you at our next session. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much,
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.